Good morning, guests. As you're joining us this morning, I'm going to give us all a few more minutes to get in and settled. We always have a few people coming in here just after the top of the hour. Hope everybody's continuing to do well and survive these interesting times, whether your children are back in school in person or doing it all remotely. I know that we're all juggling a lot when it comes to that. Give it just another minute here. Okay, well, we have a big agenda, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'll keep an eye on the waiting room as other people might show up. I can let them in. So again, welcome everyone. To those of you who maybe are joining us for the first time today, I'm Kim Stodhill. I started this series of coffees back in the spring when things started getting a little crazy with COVID, and we had a lot of questions on our mind as a counselor and as parents. I know you did, worrying about how this process might unfold in light of the global pandemic. And then 2020 has just kept on coming, I feel like, with a lot of things. And so I kind of took a break for the summer and kicked off again this fall and decided there's so much that you need to know in this process, even in a normal year, let alone with the ongoing changes and challenges that we're all facing. That so I hope that we're providing you with good information just to give you a sense of, ways to navigate this process and hopefully to reduce a little of the stress that I think it can bring on, again, even in a normal year. And so today I'm delighted to have two longtime friends and colleagues joining us. We're going to try to demystify this process a little bit. Excuse me. We want to share a little bit with you today about how colleges make decisions. And granted, we're going to hear from two professionals who've worked at a couple of different institutions. I'll let them introduce themselves, and we will learn about it from the context of where they're working right now, but it will give you some good idea about how this process in general is approached. And then we may have some time to talk a little bit about how they're seeing the impacts of 2020 on their admissions process, and if there are any advice specifically related to that they'd like to share. Without further ado, though, I'd like to turn it over and let Leanne and Rob, each of you, introduce yourselves, and then we'll dig in.
All right, well, I will kick us off. I'm Leanne Backlund. I'm the Vice President for Enrollment and Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Sewanee, the University of the South. I've been here most of my professional career. I have spent 6 years at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta, a women's college, and 3 years as a college counselor in Charleston at Porter Gowd. But otherwise, this is my 39th year in this crazy business, and who knew a pandemic would throw so many things our way. But, we have students on campus, and it sort of looks like a circus right now with 15 tents up around campus for outdoor classroom space. But we are all sort of continuing to think about how do we recruit students, how do we read applications in this time, and just know that we will do it very carefully like we always have, but we'll be putting some emphasis on some different things. So happy to be here this morning.
And good morning. I'm Rob Alexander. I'm the Dean of Admissions, Financial Aid, and Enrollment Management at the University of Rochester. I'm a native of downstate New York. I grew up in Westchester County. Then a number of educational journeys and migrations around the country. I've held senior admissions roles at Tulane University and managed the admission process there through the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, unknowingly preparing me somewhat for this very interesting and unconventional admission cycle, I think, as well. Some time out on the West Coast at the University of the Pacific, and then at Millsaps College, a small liberal arts college in Jackson, Mississippi. And I'm very new to the University of Rochester. I've started a new job in the midst of the pandemic. This was all lined up and I was ready to start as of late January, but actually began June 1st. So we are also in person, gave our students the option of beginning this semester online remotely or coming to campus. More than 85% of students chose to come to campus. We've administered somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 tests and have seen 5 positives, all in the initial wave, and took great care with those cases. I credit that to our fantastic University of Rochester Medical Center that really is the largest employer and the healthcare juggernaut in our part of the state. And our campus is doing great and thriving. We also have a very large international population. Many of those are the students that could not physically come to campus, but they are having, I think, a surprisingly engaging remote experience online. So overall, 12,000 students, 3,000 faculty, 30,000 staff, largely driven by that medical center. And among the United States leading research institutions, perhaps our biggest distinction is that for our undergraduates, we have no required courses. So we seek to find the best and brightest students from around the world and trust them to choose what they love to study and really build their own curriculum with some guidance and with some guardrails.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Again, well, actually, quick note for the audience. Those of you who've joined us before, you know this, but you are welcome to ask questions at any point. If you want to drop a message into the chat, I'm happy to read it to our panelists. And of course, if you just want to unmute, you are welcome to do that and tell us that we need to pause or slow down or repeat something if it, we understand technology is not always perfect in these situations. But I want us to get started by I'm going to just have each of both Leanne and Rob spend a minute or two telling us in general, how does the process work from sort of the time you receive an application to when you're at the point of making decisions, just to sort of, again, to the point you can share a little transparency about what happens to my application once it gets to you all.
Rob, I'll let you start on this one.
Certainly. So the University of Rochester receives about 20,000 applications, but every single application is read at least twice. We take great care and amongst our peers have been a leader in a very holistic review and one that has for nearly a decade been test flexible. Last year, pre-pandemic, University of Rochester moved to test optional, and that is where we remain today. So that's a very important point, and one that is now being adopted very widely at the majority of US colleges and universities. So every application submitted to the university receives a minimum of 2 reviews. The first review is pretty in-depth. It is designed to assess applicants' achievement and their potential for academic success at Rochester, but it's done in light of that student's particular context. The second review is done to review the applicant through the lens of our institutional goals and priorities. So one of the things that you probably have realized working with Kim is that we are trying to shape a class, and there is no perfect applicant. But we do have a vision in mind for our perfect class. And from one year to the next, that may vary. We might be looking for a soccer goalie in one particular year, but in the following year, we might not need a soccer goalie. So that will be part of that secondary review. If those 2 reviews come into agreement, and they are done independently, but if they line up, and that's it. The decision is done, both for admission and for recommendations for merit scholarship. If they do not agree, then that application moves on to a committee read. The first read is typically done by a regionally assigned geographic territory manager. For some of our students, that's someone embedded in Chicago or on the West Coast. For our students in the New York area, we have the state carved up into various regions assigned to different staff members so that they can get to know particular high schools, particular counselors, and help understand the context of what's available to that student at their school. That will lead to, I'm sure, some discussion that we'll have over the next 45 minutes about the particulars of this year. And my message that I'll probably say over and over is, don't worry about the opportunities that your students won't have this year. We know that that context has shifted dramatically. Maybe it's that their sport is not competing. Maybe it's that their extracurricular is simply not going to be available. But what we'll focus on is, what did they do with the time, with the resources, with the opportunity that they did have available? And some self-reflection, some introspection, some time with family is just as valuable as perhaps those things that they would have done in a more traditional senior year or junior year.
All right. Well, at Swanee and Agnes Scott, the other place I worked, Rob used a term that I want to make sure everyone understands: holistic. When we talk about holistic review, we're saying we're going to take everything we ask a student to submit. That goes into the consideration as we're making our decisions. So it is the application itself. How have they completed that application? Whether it's the Common Application, which there are over 900 schools that are members of the Common App. They may be applying to a coalition school. They may use a coalition application. It may be an application that's just for that college, the own college application. But I'll refer to the Common App, even though I'm referring to every application. So when a student completes that application, we're going to be starting with that. And the nice thing about the Common App is they can submit that first part, the demographic part. They can write one essay and use it for several different schools. So that makes it great. But when we talk about holistic, we are looking at the application, the letters of recommendations. The transcript really gets most of our focus, from looking at trends in grades, looking at how students have challenged themselves within the curriculum offered at their school. So it's not just a GPA, but have they been improving as they've been going along? Things that students have been involved with, and Rob touched on this, we know things have changed because we have our students back, but there's not a football game to be found on campus, but the team is still practicing. So it's interesting to see how high schools are working around this. But I think it's important to know that the transcript, the grades, the trends in the grades, the curriculum, that's going to carry the most weight. We are also a test optional school. Swanee's been test optional since 2009. And as Rob mentioned, there are a lot of schools that are test optional this year, and it may be for 1 year or a 3-year pilot. I laugh with some of my colleagues and say, you may find that you love being test optional because you get to know the students a little better. You have to dig a little deeper about what's really important to them, and it's not just a test score. So I think that's important to know. So we know that the first read will always be by the counselor for that territory, similar to Rochester. And for us, we often do read in pairs. Like we have a new counselor this year, so he is reading with others. So he learns how to do the reading. But if after the pair or a single person reads, and it goes to a second read, and then I'm often a third read. And if there's any dissension, then we take it to, we have actually a committee that's made up of a dean, 2 deans, 5 faculty, and 2 students. So we will have others review if there's some reason we really want to take an application and they just don't fit the profile, but here's why. Or there's someone that really wants that student and we don't think they fit the profile, we may take it to that faculty committee. But note that it's very carefully read and reviewed. The essays, that what we're trying to do is learn more about the student. So it doesn't have to be a piece of prose that's ready to be published, but what kind of story is the student telling? It's almost like you can work with your children about how are they going to build their story through the application, the demographic information, their academic chapter defined by the transcript, the school report, their activities, how have they invested their time before pandemic, during the pandemic, now if they're back in school, the essay. Just know that students are building their story. So we want to know what their story is and how they're going to contribute to our campuses, whether it's Suwanee, Rochester, or so many different places in between.
Great, thank you. So some of the questions I get, so that's where I'm going to just sort of frame this and we'll go from there. And again, audience members, please type questions as we go if you have them. But so let's talk a little bit about high school context. That's, you know, you've touched on grades and understanding sort of trends and patterns in that. But not all high schools are created equal. And even, I think I've mentioned to you two, and you all are familiar somewhat, I'm sure, with our high schools in Charlotte, but high schools where you have to make a choice between, are you going to take the IB track or the AP track, or just do what's best for you in either situation. Love your thoughts on how you understand that in terms of comparing apples to oranges when you're getting all of these applications. And can you share that with us? How do you understand context?
The first thing that I always mention is that we're not simply seeing a report card. We're not even simply seeing a transcript. We're getting a much deeper dive through a very helpful piece of paper. Often this year, I think we'll be going to a lot of high school websites to look at the high school profile form. And that gives us a much richer context, even for a school that might be relatively infrequently seen by that particular admissions reader. So that will tell us what the menu of course offerings are at that school. It will give us a sense of the percentage of students who graduate and go on to four-year colleges and universities. It will probably tell us a little bit about the teachers at the school. Certainly, it will give us insight into things like the offerings in terms of advanced courses, APs, IBs, honors courses, dual enrollment opportunities, so that we can then see, given the opportunities available to this particular student, how did they either minimally or maximally optimize those offerings? And perhaps did they even go above and beyond? Did they take advantage of opportunities for summer programs? Did they work to educate and grow intellectually even beyond what was offered at their school? And in the same way, looking holistically, back to that word again, trying to determine for this particular student in context, even beyond the school, within their family, what did they have the resources for? Is this a student that had the financial resources, the time flexibility to do some of those above and beyond kinds of things? Or is this a student that was working at mom or dad's restaurant after school? And did that maybe even limit the opportunities? And did the student tell us, perhaps, how that limited their opportunities to maximize the offerings academically at their school or beyond? So we're trying to get that sense. And again, there are lots of opportunities to indirectly, but also directly get that sense. We offer the opportunity for parents to also submit their own recommendation and essay and give us some context for their student. We certainly look at the student's essay. And then a super important piece is a counselor or teacher recommendation form. They can also often speak to whether this is a student who has exceeded the top 1% of all the students they've ever worked with over the course of their entire career in terms of maximizing and utilizing all the opportunities available in their context.
I think the one other thing I would add, and I think Rob's right, the profile this year is going to be so important for all of us, because while I have a school visit at 10:20 today in South Carolina, even though I'll be sitting right here at home, but not having the chance to be in conversation with counselors, I think we're going to, what's new at the school, so I think the profile will be critical, like it always is. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is college people like Rob and myself, we don't hesitate to get on the phone with a counselor. to say, I need a little more context, or can you explain what happened this semester? Or so just know that there's a two-way conversation that's going between the colleges and the high school counselors and with the student themselves. I mean, we offer a lot. I mean, we are smaller, 1,700 students, not as large as Rochester. So, we want to try to get to know these students so they can say to us, you're going to notice this on my transcript. I had a dip in the sophomore year, and let me tell you why. But I think it's really important to realize that there's often conversations, phone conversations, email, when we need a little more information about a school, a class. It's often Rob mentioned the school report, in that, excuse me, in that counselor letter that says, oh my gosh, he made a B in this class, and that's the highest grade that's ever been awarded in that class. So I think there's just a lot about context that we try hard to make sure that we understand, but know that we work hard to understand that as well.
Thank you. I think that's really important. And I'm going to veer off my original plan a little bit and go ahead and have you all touch on part of the application. One that's new this year is having the COVID question. And also the part that's always been there, at least in my memory, has been the additional information question. Is there basically anything else that you would like to share with us? And my advice as a counselor, both working in school and now independently, has often been, let's think about your story, just like Leanne was talking about in the beginning. And if there's something that needs greater explanation or just something that we haven't captured elsewhere, this is your opportunity to share it. But I'd love to hear reflections from both of you on the COVID question and the additional information question as well, and how you've seen that used well, if at all, in the process. COVID you haven't seen used yet, obviously, but maybe what are you expecting in the COVID question this year?
I can tell you that the Common App added the COVID question, and it is optional. And I often say to students, don't overthink this. But if there was something that happened, we don't have to look far to know that the last 5 to 6 months have just been crazy for all of us. And for some students, COVID has probably impacted them more than others. A family member perhaps died of the virus, or a family job loss. So I think if there's something that a student, if there's additional information that you want the admission readers to know about the impact of COVID, then I think it's a 250 word max, so it's not a long essay, but I think it's a good opportunity. That way you are not, we're not reading every essay about the COVID, which is what we don't want to do, is read every essay about COVID, because we want to get to know the student in the broader context. So I would say to students, don't overthink this, but if you or your family have really been impacted, let us know that. So I think that's the direction we'll see in the COVID question. Additional information, I think that's a great place for students to dig a little deeper, tell us a little more about, perhaps it's an activity that they've really focused on, or perhaps it's something that's outside the context of the high school that we may not know otherwise that they've really been focused on. And I think when students complete their application, I often tell them, don't think just about what you've been involved with within the 4 walls of your high school. Perhaps you've been involved in scouting. Perhaps you're involved in church. You may do a lot of community work outside of high school. So I think the additional information can really be a fun way for us to learn a little bit more about what's important to that student. The COVID question, totally optional. But I think additional information, I think, is a missed opportunity if a student doesn't think about, oh, I really want them to know this about me.
I love the way Leanne framed this as your story. This really is the opportunity to tell your story. And if COVID is an important thread in that narrative, absolutely we want to hear it. In a typical year, what we might say is use the opportunities that you have through these optional essays, through interviews that might be available. And we do have the opportunity for any applicant to interview, to share something that we might otherwise not understand, not know, or not have that context for. So it might be a dip in the GPA, maybe because of something that happened at home, and maybe because of, a case of mononucleosis. It might be totally unrelated to COVID. So that's important. The guiding question behind our admission decisions is, how has this student made their community ever better? That's a translation of our Latin motto, Meliora, that means ever better. And that question can be answered in limitless and unpredictable ways. And we will see students who answer that question while they're answering the COVID question. But we'll also see students who answer how they've made their community ever better in ways that have nothing to do with COVID, and might be the exact same way that they would have answered that question had there not been a pandemic this year. So it's all about telling that unique story and getting to the heart of maybe the primary narrative of that story, but it doesn't need to be a monolithic and one-dimensional narrative either. So we know that students do multiple activities, that they bring not just one piece of themselves to our campus, but they bring all of the dimensions of self that they're still exploring. We also know that there are lots of high school students who haven't had life-changing impacts and events and moments in their life yet. We want them to come to our campus and maybe have some when they get there. So it's perfectly okay if that narrative of your life is not necessarily worthy of an Oscar-winning movie script yet. That's okay. Just give us a sense of who you are, what you've done to make yourself and others around you better, and we'll then glean a sense of how you might make our community on our campus better.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions in the chat I'll try to respond to quickly. One talks about the resume, and if you did multiple things, especially in something big and broad like scouting you mentioned, there can be multiple leadership opportunities, multiple trips you've taken, lots of things, and obviously the Common App is limited in what you can literally put into the 150 character count of your descriptions. And so, I think, in my opinion, that's the perfect opportunity to add something else in the additional information section. If that is some activity that really warrants elaboration, that's a perfect place to put that information. Some schools are even allowing an upload of another handcrafted resume, something you've done in a Word document or something like that, that does allow for expansion as well. But oftentimes my students are using that additional information section, I find, to elaborate on extracurriculars, which is what Rob was touching on as well in terms of that. Let's talk a little bit about, let's jump into testing, because you all work at institutions that you've figured this out. You all have been test optional. You understand how this works. Clearly, there are some of our friends and colleagues in this admissions business who are going to be doing this the first time this year. But to be honest, there's a lot of anxiety about it with my students and families. And so, the question here is, how will schools view the students who have taken SAT or ACT and those who have not? And do you think that all testing will or will not be considered? You all have experience with test optional. Kind of walk us through, how do you compare? Because again, we're talking apples and oranges when you've got a test score versus when you don't.
It's interesting working at the two places I've worked. At some point they required test scores, and then both went test optional. And I think what's fun about being test optional is the focus becomes even more on transcript, what the student has done with the time outside the classroom, as well as what they've done in the classroom. I think a lot of colleges will be struggling with how do we figure this out? But you know what? They're smart people and they will figure it out. There will be other markers. They'll be looking at, how have they taken advantage of the curriculum offered? And, I'm a firm believer in that students should not take every IP offered. I mean, I often say if I'd taken AP calculus in high school, I'd still be in high school trying to pass AP calculus. But I do encourage students to challenge themselves in their areas of strength and interest. So if a student sits down with me and tells me about how much they love English and reading, and then can't give me a book they've read or a favorite author, I sort of worry about that. So I think if a student has a real area of strength and a real area of interest, then that's where they really need to be challenged themselves. And I think for the schools that are now going to be test optional, because there are just no test scores to look at, they'll figure it out because they'll dig a little deeper in the transcript. They'll dig a little deeper within the other pieces of that application, that other parts of the story that the student has submitted. And that's going to be really important this year as we all figure this out. Many schools are now saying there will be test blind. You know, they're not going to, even if a student sends a test score, they're not going to look at it. If we already have a test score in our system and a student applies as test optional, then we block that test score. We cannot see that test score as we're reviewing application. That's just what it means to be test optional. We also know that a lot of students will game the system and they take a lot of test prep. They spend a lot of money on test prep. So it's, you know, they have better ways of knowing how to guess. They're better guessers. So I think that there's a lot to be said for moving in this direction. And I think another thing, and Kim can help you with this, a lot of schools will say they're test optional, but they may require other things. We require an essay, an additional graded sample. We require an interview. Make sure that you know if it's test optional, if a school says they're test optional, is there something else they want you to submit? And just test optional just does not mean test optional at every place. It's not the same.
I can perhaps offer some quantitative data that might reassure Ashley, who asked this question, and many others. The same percentage of our applicants last year who applied without a test, it was the exact same percentage of our incoming class that did not submit a test. So I think that, you know, very clearly demonstrates that there was no disadvantage. I think that percentage will grow significantly this year, but again, we don't anticipate a disparity in the way we review or in the representation of our applicant pool and our enrolled pool between those who submitted tests and those who did not. We decided not to go test blind because there are students who frankly are great test takers and will be great at many of the quantitative assessments that, for example, our engineering school you know, will require of them through their 4 years, and they want to present those tests as a demonstration of their academic preparedness, and we, you know, want to honor that. At the same time, I very much agree with Leanne that this will be a seismic shift in the admissions world, and we will see, thankfully, less reliance on this one single measure of how a student performs over 4 hours on a particular day, and much more emphasis on how a student has performed over 4 years or more. And frankly, that tells us a lot more about that fit for the particular student with our particular institution.
That's great, thank you. Let's move on to letters of recommendation, because that also relates to one of the questions in the chat about, you know, when you're at a large public high school, you might not have the opportunity to have a strong relationship with your counselor, and even challenging times with teachers right now. If we end up with junior year being completely remote, those are obviously the teachers often that we lean on to write those letters of recommendation. So just thoughts about that in general, and then otherwise, tell us a little more about what you're looking for in those letters of recommendation and in what context they give you about a student.
The letter of recommendation does not necessarily need only be from that counselor. So the counselor recommendation may be a very sort of rote, formatted, surface level piece. If that's going to be the case, we would hope that the student would present another recommendation that they would add on from someone who does know them really well. Maybe that is a teacher, maybe that's a coach, maybe that's a pastor, but that opportunity to hear from someone who can, I call it, triangulate for us some of the things that the student is telling us themselves, some of the things that we're gleaning indirectly from the transcript, from the resume, from the students' activities. That offers, in most cases, a lot of reassurance. The other thing that often an adult can speak to in ways that can be sometimes just as impactful or maybe more impactful than a student is, what are the values that this student has represented in their life so far, and how do those align with our values? Another thing that I think makes Rochester stand out amongst its large research institution peers, even though we're not a religiously affiliated institution, we are very values driven, and we are really looking to see, particularly in that second review and during our application review process, does this student demonstrate an alignment with our values? We're a school that takes very seriously and has rescinded offers of admission in the past to students whose behavior post-admission seems to stand in direct conflict with our values as an institution. So that's another thing that I think you as a family can consider when you're thinking about whom is best suited to write this maybe additional letter for the student and give us that context of their values.
I think Rob is spot on there. I think it's important to think about, we think about letters as they add some fabric to the numbers, they add some dimension to the student. And, we all are taught not to be bragging about some of our accomplishments. And sometimes we hear some really cool things about what a student has done in the classroom by helping other students or outside the classroom from a teacher or, other people. The only thing I would caution is don't send in too many letters of recommendation, because then we start worrying about what's wrong here. And if you have someone writing an additional letter, make sure that person knows the student. It doesn't do us any good to get a letter that says, I've known so-and-so's parents, but I've never met that student. We're not admitting the parents. There are some parents we would not admit where we want to admit their students. So I think just be cautious about how many additional, but I think Rob is right. A coach can know so much about a student. An employer can know so much about a student if the child is working part-time. Someone at church might know a lot, a scout leader. I think there are people who know a lot about your children, and that can be really beneficial to us. Because Rob said in one of the earlier comments, I talk about a student building their story. We're building a class. We're looking for students who are come in and not every student is going to be well-rounded. Not every student is going to be talented in one or two things. And that's the beauty of when they get in community, they all have these different things that they add. And it's just so much fun to watch classes come together and build off each other. So the letters, we do read them. They do add fabric or dimension to the student. And those are really helpful.
Great, thank you. So another big part of telling the story is obviously essays, and I've done a whole session on essays. So, but I just want to touch on it. But one of the questions that came to me specifically in chat was, should students ignore their feelings about political environment, elections? There's a lot going on in our world right now that is charged with some emotion. And so, and I'm getting that just from students as I'm talking to them one-on-one, some who very much want to say certain things and are, then are more guarded because I don't want to, my philosophy usually is if the college doesn't want you because of your opinion, maybe it's not the right place for you, but would love to know what you all say in general if you get some of those kinds of, we'll call them politically charged essays in this process, because that might very well happen this year.
I'd say that we're not looking for editorials that might appear in highly partisan publications, but we are looking for heartfelt opinions that tell us more about the student and their values. And there's a subtle but very important difference there. Is what the student is writing about them, and does it narrate their story, or is it simply about the political landscape and maybe gives us a sense of their writing ability, and of their ability to take a course with our political science faculty? In the admission office, that's very, very much less important than if they're telling us about them, and again, about what they value, about what they're passionate about. So there certainly have been very effective essays in election years, or about political and issues that could be certainly viewed as partisan. But in the end, when done well, those essays were about the student, not about the issue, not about the politician, not about the political party.
Yeah, I agree totally. And, I think that I think we will read a few more politically charged essays this year, and whether it's around the elections, whether it's around the Black Lives Matters, I think there's just going to be climate change. Oh my gosh, it's just, I think there's going to be so many hot topics. But I think, if students are writing about some political something, how is that impacting them? Did they work for, were they a volunteer for a political campaign, and how did that introduce them more to the field of politics? Or, often we'll say, when Katrina hit and Rob was at Tulane, we had more students writing about the impact of Katrina. I'm like, you live in North Dakota, so I think they have to really be thinking about, we want to know about the student. And the essay is something they have total control over. That's a great place to tell their story. And it may be an event that impacted them. But I do think they want to not write about something that they think is going to offend a reader, and you don't know what that's going to be. So if it's something about politics, what is it about politics that impacted that student? So.
Thank you. So another question that was sent to me privately was, and it probably relates to the additional information section again, but the question is, my student did not do well with remote learning. So when school closed last spring, ended up taking 2 pass grades instead of usual A's or B's, because otherwise these would have been C's. Should this be addressed and explained, or is it self-evident? In other words, so I think you all probably know the context. You'll know it a lot when you get Charlotte applications, though, that in CMS in particular, you could choose pass grades or withdraw, or you could take the grades that you earned. And so we have some students who have a mixture because of this, because some classes were certainly more challenging in the remote environment last spring. Anyway, thoughts on that in general? That to me could be a COVID answer, that could be an additional information answer, or does it need to be addressed at all? What do you all think?
I think Rob talked about the profile earlier, and I think we're going to see some different profiles this year because of how schools handled remote learning. We have a faculty member here whose son did not do well remotely. Still went to a great college, but how do we explain that this grade in the math course, because he just couldn't get it? I think if it's a pass fail and they pass, we're going to read that as a pass. We're not going to penalize a student because they took a pass instead of taking the grade. That grade may have been an A, it may have been a B, but I think that's where we're going to be looking at what the schools decided, how they decided to handle the remote learning. And I will say, I think in March when we all had to, pivot so quickly, I think we handled it pretty well. My guess is if they're still remote in the fall, they're handling it much better. I think the teachers had time to prepare better. I know the faculty here certainly spent the summer taking a lot of courses on how to be a better virtual teacher, even though 90% of our students are here. The 10% who are having to do remotely, we want to make sure that they're engaged through, small class discussions. Our international students, they're not going to be in class at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, they're going to be watching that video later because of the time change. But I think if a student took a pass instead of a grade, that's fine. I think that's a great place for additional information, or perhaps a COVID question. This is what I've learned about myself. I'm not going to go to a school where all I have is online learning. I need the stimulation. I need the class discussion. I need more direct attention from the faculty. I think that's a great learning opportunity for the students to explain to us.
Absolutely. We know that students, ourselves, our staffs, faced myriad challenges, and we would be surprised if we didn't see a way that all of these challenges manifest in a student's application portfolio. So I think it behooves a student to embrace that and make that part of their story that they tell us if in fact it did. In this case, a pass is a pass and not going to be seen as a negative. But if there was something even more substantial than that, it's going to be okay. We do understand that students are people and that they are impacted by all of the unpredictable and sometimes negative circumstances around them. But in Rochester's example specifically, again, remember that I said our open curriculum means we don't have any specific courses that are required. We do have some menus of offerings and some ways to ensure that students are developing a well-rounded set of knowledge and skills. But we also understand that students have strengths and weaknesses. They have areas that they are more and less interested in, but we know that many of them don't have a lot of freedom and flexibility in their curricula and those choices while they're in high school. So we can very much respect and understand from our perspective when a student tells us, maybe in this case, math is not my strongest or favorite subject. I struggle, but work really hard to overcome that struggle in every math class that I've ever taken. And this shift to the online format made that struggle feel insurmountable for me. And I decided to go with a pass and with tell us the story. How did you get through it? Because clearly that pass is a much better outcome than a fail. So when students have an opportunity to tell us how they overcame adversity or how they bolstered a weakness and still made it, that's a really compelling piece of that narrative that they can tell us in their essays, in their interview. We don't just want to know about every easy win that students have had. We want to know a little bit about the struggles and about the ways they work through challenging situations.
You know, one thing Rob just said, he said, students are people. Those of us reading applications and working on building classes, we're people too. So we've all been impacted by this. So we're going to be reading applications through a different lens, thinking about how has this impacted that school, that student, how did it impact our institutions? So just know that there's not going to be a formula for the most part. For when schools say we read holistically, there's not a formula. They're taking everything into consideration. And it may be a great letter recommendation, maybe from that math teacher who said, you know, Rob really struggled, but let me tell you what he did to get through it. So I think sometimes those letters can be so impactful for us.
I'm often struggling. I need a lot of help to get through things.
Yeah.
I do want to make a point too that there are lots of schools, probably the majority of schools, that have admissions committees and an approach like what you're hearing from us today. There are other schools, particularly very large public institutions, that do have to rely on some formulae that can, cull huge application pools down into, there probably are still some deep dives and very personal and holistic reviews of certain segments of their application pools. But again, this does go to that question of fit. If your student is someone who's going to need individualized attention and a customized approach and support through their college years, well, the admission process will likely suss out whether a particular school is the right fit for them or not, because our admissions protocols are intentionally designed to reflect the nature of the experience at our institutions. It is not the same process at every single school. It very much, and one of the great joys of working in this profession and changing schools, maybe twice a decade or so, is getting to experience and embrace a new approach, a new culture at that school, and understand how it makes the admission process tick.
Thank you. Okay, this question actually is a great segue into one of the topics I want to be sure in our few minutes left we touch on, which is class rank. And in our big public schools in Charlotte in particular, class rank gets to be, sometimes it feels a bit of an arms race of people, trying to game the system, so to speak, or, taking as many weighted classes as they possibly can, those kinds of things. But this question also then touches on taking the pass fail. Like, some students did that in essence to protect their GPA, and that, helped them in the class rank status. But let's touch on class rank in general, and just, how important is it? Let's just do that, because that's, I think it really gets to the heart of this question, is how much should we be emphasizing this factor?
Not class rank, not every school ranks. We know that. I know there are ways to game the ranking system by, a student who protects their GPA by not challenging themselves. Others who take perhaps, I know between AP and IB, do you get more weight if you take an IB course as opposed to an AP course? I think what you have to be confident if you're applying to a place that it does a holistic review. The formula places that Rob just touched on, those numbers are just going to be those numbers. But I think you have to be confident that as we're looking at class rank, we're also looking at grade trends, and we're looking at the curriculum a student has chosen for themselves. Some things will be required in the high school, some things will not, but we're not looking at class rank as a standalone piece of information. It is put in context of the whole transcript of the school, of the weighting, if there is weighting. So class rank, yes, we know it can be gained, but it's amazing to me. We were talking about class rank yesterday in the Vice Chancellor's Cabinet meeting about how many schools no longer rank, and what does the rank really tell us? I think for a Sewanee, for a Rochester, for so many great schools, the class rank is just like a test score, just one piece of the puzzle. It's not going to be the most important piece. That curriculum, those grade trends, that's going to tell us a whole lot more. Because if a student started off without being the best student as a ninth grader, and I think that happens a lot, it's hard to rebound on class rank. But if we can see that rebound in grade trends and continuously taking harder courses as they become juniors and seniors, that's going to be more significant. Rob, what would you add?
That is so well said. I have nothing to add.
Excellent. Well, that means we might have time for this one last question, which is sort of a broader question that has been asked on many of my calls. We're hearing lots of rumors of the impact of COVID on numbers at schools, enrollment, and, are we going to see bigger classes admitted this year? Are we going to see other trends? I mean, do you even know at this point? I mean, I just was on a call with Chapel Hill this week, and last year's class was a bigger class than they had anticipated. And right now, they don't know yet. I mean, you all are at some higher levels in your administration, but sometimes admissions folks don't know what the ultimate number is going to be handed down until even later in the process. But would love your thoughts on that before we close out here today.
I suspect there will be impacts, but I don't think that they are impacts that we know definitively yet, because we still have to wait and see what the spring activity looks like. And I would say that these kinds of impacts happen every single year. They're simply not publicly talked about in headlines. Um, there are many institutions that will over-enroll or under-enroll in a given year, and that then impacts what they need to do to fill their campus or to reduce the size of an incoming class the following year. So those same kinds of decisions will come into play. I don't know that it will have any bearing on what a particular applicant presents in their application, or the way that a single applicant or counselor advises a group of their advisees in terms of how to find the best fit institution. There'll be places that will be looking for smaller groups. There will be places that will be looking for larger groups because they maybe now have more students willing to go remote, and that means they have more spaces in those first year residence halls to fill. So I don't know that one can accurately predict across the landscape. Perhaps there's research that could be done into a particular school, but still the impact on a particular admission decision for an individual applicant will be negligible.
I agree. And I think also keep in mind demographics are shifting in the United States. So as we are working our way through, and there are going to be fewer and fewer high school students. So I think, the demographic shift, will international students be able to come into the country? Or will they still remain remote? Will they want to come into the United States? So I think there's just so many things. We didn't see a huge increase in the request for defers. And I think it's because we were, and Rochester may have been the same, because we were going to be on campus teaching. About 10% of our students are remote. Some of those are international students. Some of those are students who may have underlying health issues that just can't be in community with us. So I think it is going to vary from school to school. I mean, on average, we usually get 8 to 10 requests for a gap year or a defer. This year we had 13. So it was not a huge increase at all, but that may have been because we were not totally remote. So I think Rob's right. It's going to play out, but I'm not going to read an application and say, I don't have room for that one, even though that's a great student. I don't have room this year. But I think you have to know, we're looking at demographics. We're looking at, can our students study abroad? Will it be safe for them to travel abroad? Will it be safe for our international students to come to campus? There's just so much in the works as we think about class size.
And I just want to reiterate Rob's point that this happens behind the scenes in many admissions offices all the time. When I worked at the University of Miami, we over-enrolled the year after we won a national championship in football. That wasn't anything we were predicting, but kids were sleeping in the hotel across the street that first semester because of that, and we had to adjust going forward. Last, we're at the hour. I just want to ask both Rob and Leanne, do you have any last minute parting shots, words of wisdom that you would share with this group of parents that are here with us today?
I'll share that this group and other folks that work with Kim are incredibly lucky, because you are getting some of the best advice and working with one of the experts in this field. And that, more than anything else that you're doing, is probably giving you a tremendous advantage. And one of the things that we wish is that many more students and families could get this depth of knowledge and understanding into the process. And we try to do workshops and provide information broadly to the public and to our inquiry pools to share this. But kudos to all of you for spending the time and the resources to do this for your own edification and for your kids.
Thanks, Rob.
I agree.
Uh-oh.
Great. I think the one thing I would say, and I would say to you as parents, but I would urge you to encourage your students, don't worry about the things you can't control. There are so many things, factors out there, the pandemic, the politically charged. Don't worry about the things you can't control, but really take charge of the things you can. That student essay, how hard they decide to study and challenge themselves. Those are things they have control over. And I think it's really important to realize that while colleges are not open to visits right now for the most part, the virtual visits, that's a great way for students to really get to know a place and have some time with an admission counselor or with current students. So encourage them to take advantage of all the virtual opportunities that we are offering.
Great advice. Well, as always, we could go on and on. There's a lot to unpack in this process, but I'm very grateful to Rob and Leanne for your time this morning, to our audience for being here to listen to these two experts. And as always, thank you, everyone. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you have follow-up questions for Rob and Leanne, I'm sure they would be happy to share an email and I can connect you with them. So thank you all. Be well, be safe, and hope to see you in person soon. Down the line. So, bye.